afraid, they didn't show us. But we would never forget our escape from Vietnam. We were lost.
What was your job in Vietnam?
University professor.
We had no home.
Do you have any family in Canada?
No, sir.
Nobody wanted us.
Welcome to Canada.
Canada chose us.
Canadians opened their borders, their homes, and their hearts to more than 100,000 refugees fleeing persecution after the Vietnam War.
We were home.
Hi, I'm Bob Lennon, host of the Northern Heat Report. Join me for these inspiring stories of people who have helped make New Brunswick such an amazing place to live, visit, and experience. Don't miss our next episode of the Northern Heat Report right here on Rogers TV.
This is Rogers TV. The opinions expressed in the following programs are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers Cable or Rogers TV.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Nbpoli Pod. We are here in Menaquith, also known as St. John, the unceded territory of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Pescatawamacati peoples. So today we have a exciting guest, but we're going to kick off with a couple of little New Brunswick hot takes here.
Some hot takes, some quick 2 or 3 minutes here. Yeah, we've been talking about this lineup of guests we have.
Yes.
We are also super jazzed that we might be getting a couple NDP organizers on here, including Jordan Leichnick. So if anybody has been following the election dailies from CBC or Cursive Politics, especially if you listen to Cursive Politics, you will have heard of Jordan. Jordan was very gracious when we cold called her, and so we're excited to have her on. We don't exactly know when that will be, but I remember in January we were like, wow, we got to get some guests lined up because we were talking a lot about New Brunswick politics.
It was just us two,
and it was just us two, with a few guests here and there. But we wanted to build out a schedule, so we've got a good guest today, Trevor Deley. We'll bring him on in a minute, but New Brunswick has had a bunch of stuff going on, and just recently they announced a freeze of your property tax assessment system as part of the municipal tax reform initiatives that have been kicked off by the Conservative government.
Oh, yeah.
Years
and
ago.
Our former guest here, Iwanis, had a very hot take about how municipalities are going to, feel it now. And it's our turn to, take it. And there's all this griping, and he was very excited about that. So I actually would love to have him on to discuss this.
Yes.
But the Kitchen and Slack report that City of St. John had done said freezing assessments really is not the way to do it.
No, nobody asked for this. No. So as far as people online, I saw David Hickey. He had a big walk and talk about it. Minister Hickey. I saw Susan Holt did one too. And I went on my social and said, who asked for this? Nobody, no advocacy group, no expert report, and there's plenty of them to pick from.
So go to Brent's Facebook and go chime in on his thread, because there's all kinds of back and forth going on there.
There's some nice spilled tea politically. But Jerry would be a good person to bring back because he's basically written the book for New Brunswick tax assessment, thought and process and engagement as a tax assessor himself, or a property assessor. So that'll be something we revisit and continue to talk about. But we did want to plug that before we get into today's interview, because the last 6 weeks has been almost exclusively federal stuff.
I know.
And there is stuff happening provincially. So if you have questions or if you have comments,
what's the latest story that you want us to go over?
Please email us. Please comment on our socials. Of course, you can get a hold of us anytime. nbpolipod@gmail.com. You can find us on Patreon. You can find us on our socials. That we wanted to make sure that people know we are going to revisit New Brunswick. But today we've got a pretty famous TikToker in Canada, Trevor Deley. He's got a fairly good following, and we're excited to have him on the show. And here he is now. Hello, Trevor.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on, Brent and Joanna. How are you doing?
We're doing great. We're jazzed to kind of get past the federal election stuff and now into the
more conceptual.
What's possible, what's happening. So can you tell us a little bit about your background for those in the audience that maybe don't follow you on TikTok or any of that, and just tell us what you're working on now?
Yeah, for sure. So most of my following on TikTok comes from emo 2000s nostalgia, but during the election, I shifted to talking about politics because my educational background was a bit on political philosophy. I studied neuroscience with a minor in philosophy in my undergrad. I got really into evolution and genetics, so I did a master's in a genetics lab studying data science. That took me to, it's all over the place, by the way. This is a little... that took me to a job at a civic technology startup where we were using open data from the city to just show people all the new developments that were going on and allowing them to comment if they couldn't make it to a city, you know, trying to that accessibility lens. That got me a job in software development. That funded the PhD after the Trump election. And that's how I got into like political analytics and reading more political philosophy. It's a long, I get distracted easily is what I tell people.
Yeah. Well, but you've dabbled in a lot of different areas.
It's the millennial dream.
It is. Yeah.
It's true. Yeah.
It's the pure Renaissance man.
Well, more like master of none, you know, a jack of squirrel of all trades.
Yes.
We both know this very well.
Very well.
Oh yeah. Well, that's you were telling about the tool library and, you know, all kinds of side quests, I'm sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Side quests is a great way to put it. Yes. Yeah. Still trying to figure out where the main quest is. Yeah. just busy grinding out levels here at the lower end. Doing side quests.
Exactly.
Overqualified for everything we do, but not really doing anything.
Not qualified enough.
Yeah.
So one of the things, obviously the starting point was a discussion you and I had on TikTok with this sort of take that you had of Mark Carney and sort of some of these dispositional differences that you observed and you were trying to kind of fill in the blanks on or try to suppose about, imagine what what's behind Mark Carney and driving that. And so you landed on this communitarianism lens, which is not communism for those listening. There is some disparity between the communitarian piece and the communist piece. But can you tell me, can we revisit that take? Like, what were you observing? What did you pick up on? I know you read Mark's book.
Yep.
And so I obviously can imagine some of that came from there. But yeah, can you recapture sort of some of those thoughts? Because they came out sort of mid-campaign.
Yes, yeah. Well, let's start with a definition. Communitarianism is, most people have never heard that term, I would say, and because it's a niche term from philosophical journals in the 1970s. A guy named John Rawls wrote a book with a theory of justice in the tradition of political liberalism. A bunch of people didn't like that book, even though it was a very good book, and they criticized it for a certain reason. And then John Rawls and the other liberals labeled the critics of that book communitarians. So communitarianism isn't like a fleshed out political ideology like liberalism is. It's a label that was put on a group of philosophers, Michael Sandel, Charles Taylor, and a guy named Alistair MacIntyre, who had these fundamental moral issues with an ethics of pure reason that John Rawls was writing about in his book. They said life's a bit more complicated than just putting it all into a rational box, and then we have the formula for a free and fair society. They said there's other things you have to think about. And then the liberals said, oh, liberalism's the best. You communitarians and your wild ideas. And that's how the label kind of came about.
Right.
And but it's interesting because the way it kind of weaves back in, and if I'll do a little distraction here for a moment.
Absolutely.
Something I noticed on the election night is during Mark Carney's acceptance speech, he reworked Aristotle directly as a quotation from Nicomedean ethics. So from the transcript, he said, "We become just by doing just acts, brave by doing brave acts. When we are kind, kindness grows. When we seek unity, unity grows. When we are Canadian, Canada grows." And just to compare from the Nicomedean ethics, Aristotle said, similarly, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. This truth is attested by the experience of states. Lawgivers make the citizens good by training them in habits of right action. This is the aim of all legislation, and if it fails to do this, it is a failure. This is what distinguishes a good form of constitution from a bad one. And he says, just as is the case with skill in the arts, for both the good harpers and the bad ones are produced by harping, and similarly with builders and all other craftsmen, You become a good builder by building well, and so you become a bad one from building badly. So he's directly referencing Aristotle in the speech, which
That's
is wild to me.
I didn't catch that. I mean, it's been.
It sounded familiar to me though. Like it makes so much sense.
But it's been since my third year classics course that I would have read that, I'm sure, at Mount A. Yes. But wow, that's fascinating.
And to me, the dot that it connects is a lot of communitarians, or the people who are labeled communitarians, are in fact just virtue ethicists. They're neo-Aristotelians. So Charles Taylor is a neo-Aristotelian. Alistair McIntyre, he wrote a book called Beyond Virtue. And essentially, there's a range of different arguments. But if we look at Alistair McIntyre, for example, he said this whole project of trying to come up with an ethical justification for society in just pure reason is not a worthwhile project. Alistair McIntyre rejects the Enlightenment. He says we've always been virtue ethicists. And by that he means we learn good acts by observing good people in our lives and emulating them. And he said we'd always been virtue ethicists. We were virtue ethicists during the Enlightenment, and we're virtue ethicists today. So let's just get back to that.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so, anyways,
this idea that like this exaggerated nobility of the Enlightenment to really enlighten us all to the the truth and the light that is out. Yeah, I understand that. Sentiment. And just for our audience who's watching, Joe's in and out. Beatrix is up with us right now. We usually try to get her asleep, so she'll be back and forth, but she can still hear. One of the things I remember. So Charles Taylor, you point him out, and we were talking about when I was in div school, we had to read some Charles Taylor. And I always found that fascinating, the analogies that he uses. This idea that like. He kind of describes this this like progressive march, over time, this increasing virtue ethics that you're talking about, and how we're trying to arrive at good things and doing well and doing good by people. And he says, it's like it's like one of those old radio stations that you're way out in the boonies. And all of a sudden, you'll be tuned into this AM channel that's broadcasting from super far away that you just happen to get. And he kind of uses that as this framework to say, look, this thread is very, very old, but it reaches really, really far throughout the human experience. So I kind of see what you're getting, what they're getting at there. Yeah.
Well said. Oh, that's a beautiful metaphor, really. And it's a tough one too, because we live in such a rational society. Charles Taylor, I saw him speak at Carleton a few years ago, and he talks about how the human imagination has really changed in the 20th century, and that if you ask the average person how they imagine the universe to be, their default template is the natural sciences. Right? You say, well, we're in a solar, like hopefully, right? Like we're in a solar system, we're on a planet.
Well, the flat earthers may have something to say.
Yes.
Although I would say even with flat earthers, they probably believe the flat earth is made of atoms.
Yeah.
Right. So even for the flat earthers, they're still templated by this natural science worldview. Whereas in his book, The Secular Age, he's kind of talking about how we used to have a much more symbolic and metaphorical understanding of the world and its explanations. And he's not saying one's better than the other. He's just saying that they come with different political needs and challenges. In the imaginative one, our identity as humans was baked into the way we saw the universe. As its stewards, for example, or perhaps like in a more Christian theology, its masters, right? All of our identity was baked into how we imagined the world. Whereas in the natural sciences one, we're just kind of here. We just kind of evolved, and we're like, all right, well, like, what are we doing here? It's been separated in that sense. So
there's no agreed upon criteria for us and how we operate and act anymore.
Yeah.
And they've said, they say that as it relates to our, say our middle class to higher class. There's no regard from the upper class to give back in terms of like libraries and public good and all of that kind of thing. And it was a lot more prevalent, let's say 100 years ago, with that Gilded Age than it is with this Gilded Age.
There was like a formula back in the day. I kind of see that perspective being like, when we had more of this metaphorical, religious centered mindset, it produced these sort of formulas on what does it mean to be a good person in our society. And so even for the wealthy, right, you see these major initiatives of like Carnegie and all these different
like museums,
yeah,
patronage to the community,
to the people,
and it's just a lot less prevalent now. And
it's a fight. It's a fight.
Yeah.
Yes,
but it takes different shapes now. It just kind of pops up in different places.
That's right. I've heard it described as they seek the noblesse without the oblige.
Oh yes, that is the term I was looking for.
That's right.
Noblesse oblige, because it's the obligation of the noble, right? Like
yes.
to do something because they have benefited so greatly off the masses.
Yeah, off the common.
Yes.
And I know you mentioned that there's some conservative listeners. Perhaps this is a good time to insert a Alexis de Tocqueville quote, because he's kind of he's a darling, right? Like the conservatives love him, but also the Marxists love him. So like he's great. Like anyone that can please those two crowds is probably onto something, you know. But in Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville was looking at the economics of 18th century America and essentially predicted that because of what he called the atomization of social equality, which is that, again, going back to this idea of like the issues with a pure reason foundation for a state, is if the state creates the box that each person lives in out of pure reason, the complicated aspects of our humanity are left outside of that box. It's like a cookie cutter, and you press it around the dough and it makes a shape. And that's how the state is. Like, you're a citizen now, not a human, a citizen. And everything that is outside of that is left out. And so he worried that this gives you an individuality, but a sameness. Everyone is individual in the same way. And so he worried about this idea and how it would impact the relations between the powerful and the governed. And he essentially, the thing we're talking about right now, the noblesse without the oblige, he predicted that would happen if economic forces in the United States were allowed to essentially begin to treat citizens like consumers in this manner.
Right.
Because we would be atomized from one another in these little cookie cutter shapes. We would lose our bonds and sense of community, so that we would no longer be and not that aristocracy is a good thing, but again, that relationship of the people of the Lord and that obligation to take care of them, that would be severed in Alexis de Tocqueville's prediction.
Well, and accurately so. I mean, I think we're kind of, it may seem, nebulous right now talking about these philosophical things, but going back to the Carney piece and the communitarian piece and the quote of this, I do think de Tocqueville leaves us off at that correctly, because here we are with this form of bizarre individualism that really cannot, when you think of
government is business,
the sum of all the parts being greater than, that kind of, when we come together, we can accomplish bigger things than if we were all just doing our own individual stuff. Everybody sort of has that mentality, but they don't have a lot of cultural areas to practice it in. We don't have that 100 years ago, if you needed land cleared, everybody came, they helped build your barn, they helped put everything together. There was no transfer of money, very rarely. There was just sort of mutual benefit for the community, because everybody understood, hey, if this person's successful, then if my crop fails next year, I might actually still be looked after.
Yes.
And now we don't have that need. So we've kind of resorted into these little tiny boxes. But now here we are, enter Donald Trump, the ruining of a world order, the undermining of massive institutions that have been in existence since the 50s, that have been able to navigate multiple tiers of crises, but have kind of come up short on figuring out how to tackle the climate crisis as a global community and national community, whatever. But now there's an entire question mark around, well, is even the world economic system worth salvaging? And so now we're in an era where we have to pick a direction. And Carney has been picked and come in and inserted himself, say, I want to help us pick a direction that's going to bring us back to sort of a more concerted effort. Is that how you read his book Values? Is he sort of grabbing at some of those pieces, trying to move it back?
Okay, great question and great preface. The way I'm thinking about this is, to tie everything in together, this like overly rational approach since the Enlightenment. The way I characterize that is that utilitarianism as an ethic is basically the default ethic of modern society, because it's to me, when John Stuart Mill's It was inherited by economists in the 1800s. They said we're all rational agents and want to fulfill our preferences, and we maximize utility by doing that. And then that was inherited by capitalists that said that just making a bunch of money is the best way to fulfill your freedom of choice. Yeah. And in the same way that Taylor says, like, natural sciences is the blueprint for how we imagine the world, I think that's how most people imagine their ethics. Or like, if you ask the average person, like, what does freedom mean to you? They say, well, I don't know, just like doing the stuff I want to do. Like, freedom of choice is kind of the default answer. Right. But so utilitarianism and our economic systems kind of go hand in hand, in my view. And so what is so different about Mark Carney is, because he's a banker and an economist, you'd expect him to be a utilitarian. But here he is quoting Aristotle. Here he is quoting Michael Sandel and these other virtue ethicists in his book. So what I think is happening, not that he's bringing us back, but I think he's going to use, and this is a pure speculation, I think he uses the tools of economics, right, in the utility calculations, but substitutes out the utilitarian ethic for a virtue ethic.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's exciting about it, because in his book, right, he says, I'm not a market fundamentalist. And to me, what that means is, if the stock market line goes up, it's morally right because it's good. It makes more money. More money gives you freedom of choice. Freedom of choice gives you happiness. So if the line goes up, it's good. Yeah. But the crash is in between, where people lose their businesses, where there's tensions in their marriage, where they lose their houses. Communities are ripped apart, and that's never recovered.
Right.
And so the utilitarian wouldn't care about that at all, because he says, well, in the balance of things, the line goes up, and so utility is greater on the whole.
Whereas I hear that argument made by capitalists. I'm trying to remember the Norwegian, was he Norwegian or Swedish statistician who does this deep dive into the arc of modernity, where he's like, well, look at birth mortality, or poverty rates, disease rates. He says, obviously capitalism has been very good on aggregate for everybody. Like, he kind of goes through and makes that classic argument, which was fairly convincing on the issues that he mentions. But of course, what he omits is what you're talking about too.
Yes,
it's like, maybe on aggregate on some of these, but you can't forget about.
That's a utilitarian way to think about it.
Absolutely.
Yes, which isn't inherently wrong, but utilitarianism is not an all-encompassing answer to our ethical problems. I think there are many times when you try to solve an ethical problem with a utilitarian answer, people go, oh my God, you think that's the right thing to do? Like, we have a moral aversion to the utilitarian answer, to things like, if you've heard of the trolley problem or things like that, right? There's a reverse.
Watch The Good Place.
Yeah,
I love The Good Place. Yeah. If you reverse that, there's a scenario where they ask, is it okay to have a doctor, take one patient's organs to save 5 people? And everyone goes, oh, no, definitely not.
Still alive.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they go, well, how's that different than the trolley of pulling the lever and having the trolley hit one person to save 5? And there seems to be, it's not just about the numbers. There seems to be other things at stake that are morally important to us.
Yeah. And okay. So we've got this moment now. So, like,
a moralistic prime minister.
We have
hopefully
a prime minister that has some moral opinions and is putting them on display, some virtues that he is trying to put on display. And of course, he's committed, as his words, my paraphrase of his words would be, I'm here because there's a problem. I believe I can help solve it. And we're going to do that by building big things together as a country. We're going to put in national energy corridors. We're going to do, mega projects to get the economy of Canada sort of remoored into better markets, or, more reliable markets, not just in the United States, which is an unreliable dance partner now. And I'm the guy to do it. And but he's got this national challenge.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned doing some work around conservative thought. So the biggest sort of push by conservative thought is, and I don't know whether it's a distraction or if you have an opinion on that, seems to be, well, Alberta and Saskatchewan have been left out. You guys are just taking advantage of us, so we're potentially going to separate from Canada. Like, do you see, is there anybody in that conservative camp that you think Mark? Oh wow, very opinionated about
no,
this.
get in there. We gotta.
But do you see anybody in the conservative camp who could be a dance partner on some of this stuff with a Carney?
Interesting. Yeah, great question. I think it's tricky for me because the kind of conservatism you talk about and study, like Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, is nowhere represented in modern conservative politics, which in my view is largely libertarian,
right?
Economically speaking, and libertarianism. Or yes, or Randian, exactly. But libertarianism is really an offshoot of capital L liberalism, which is so funny because I think that would melt a lot of people's brains to know that to be a libertarian is to be liberal. The way we, liberalism has changed its use. Now it's an epithet rather than a description of a political philosophy. So it's challenging, right? Because the definitions have shifted. Most people, I think, on the right are libertarians, or Christian nationalism is the new rising thing that, again, like the most conservative founding fathers, the Federalist judges of the United States would be staunchly opposed to Christian nationalism because they believed in separation of church and state. Like it's being framed as a return to the past when it isn't at all. So I find that alarming. That's the first problem. And so much of that is fueled by one, what Charles Taylor called the politics of recognition, or what we call in the news identity politics.
Right.
It's like white identitarian stuff, I think, fuels that. And then you have hybrid warfare just pumping misinformation to fuel those divisions. So that's a whole issue. The conservative movement is like being pressed apart by these geopolitical forces. Whereas if we take a more traditional progressive conservative, someone like maybe Aaron O'Toole, or even Doug Ford in Ontario, who's quite popular, those kinds of ideas, they're still only going back to the 80s, right? These are neoliberals, which are essentially still utilitarians.
Yes.
And so I think that could work, right? If we go back to even a neoliberal style conservative, at least someone like Mark Carney speaks the same language of them, in the language of economics.
Right.
So that could be a much better dance partner, let's say, than someone who's like, no, my religion just needs to be the law. There's no way Mark Carney can negotiate with that, because it's a faith-based position, right? It's completely outside of the Enlightenment project for political society.
Yes. No, that's it's a good point. And we've
come up against a Christian nationalist here.
We were sued by one.
What?
Yeah. We had the same lawyers that were able to get Rebel News, their media credentials.
Wow.
Come at us from Faitine Grasecci, who is sort of a prophet in the charismatic church movement, going back a long time. She started the For My Canada group. She has started. It's very much a pro or anti-choice, pro-life movement that goes back to the early 2000s. She moved here from Ontario. Like, she's on Faith TV. She has all this following.
She ran for the PC government.
She ran for our former premier, Blaine Higgs. So we made some national news for some very wrong reasons by having a fair bit of Christian nationalist fundraising money come from Alberta, but also through Faitine, as she ran up the road just from where we live now. I mean, she didn't win. She came close, but she didn't win. And she ran in a riding that has voted blue like 9 times out of 10 since Confederation.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they did lose it. And again, one more plus for the Liberals in this province. But yeah, so that Christian nationalism thing, and I guess we haven't seen it as much at the federal level.
I mean, there's definitely a few of them around that are.
Oh yeah, definitely social conservatives exist in the caucus. But I mean, when the election was happening in Manitoba, there was Canada Land did a bit of coverage tracking some of the donations that were coming in there for the conservative leader against Wab Kinew, and then our election happened later. And we were seeing that too, and so
it's the whole national organizing around these provincial elections that's alarming.
Yeah. Especially in New Brunswick, because it's not illegal to donate to provincial parties out of province, and that's actually illegal in most provinces.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so that's, again, to that topic of like them, there's incredibly well organized, seems to be global financing networks. And Nidhi, who you had on as well, I love the video she did about petrol populism, right? This idea that oil and gas companies will fund populist political movements because you can have a strong voter base rather than just lobbying politicians, right? They get the people all frothy about oil and gas, and then it kind of does their job for them. I think the issue is that these aren't genuine conservative principles, right? They've completely abandoned Edmund Burke and Alexei de Tocqueville in pursuing these purely libertarian aims. The funny thing that I think is that modern progressives and conservatism of Edmund Burke have a lot more in common than they realize, which is that they're both anti-utilitarian. Edmund Burke,
you know, it's so funny because I have been, and Joe can attest to this, but ever since becoming politically active, I've been accused of being, you know, a Christian evangelical in disguise who's trying to brand himself as progressive by running for the Greens. I've been accused of being a major leftist by conservatives and a communist. I've been accused of being on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that it comes down because when you have a nuanced set of beliefs and you have a position in one sense that is built on a virtue of something that produces this type of decision, but in another situation, there's other things that make you choose differently. You're not easily boxed in. People don't know what to do with that because you're not showing a consistent line in their view. But, you know, Edmund Burke said, I don't know if it was Edmund Burke that said this or somebody who was sort of giving a synopsis of Edmund Burke. But one of the things I've talked about, I don't have a lot of that modern conservatism in me, but if there is an area where I sort of have a bent toward conservatives, it's that you don't tear down a fence until you know why it was built. Like this kind of, and I don't know if that was a Burke.
That's Burke. Yeah, that's definitely Burke.
So, and I think when you say that to most people, they're like, oh, of course.
Yeah.
Super, you know, very leftist individuals would be like, no, we're tearing down any fence. It doesn't matter which fence it is. I'm unloading on every fence, right?
Yeah, because they're like, I have the right rational answer, right?
Yeah.
And my reason is a bulldozer to clear society for the good things that I want for it, right?
Yeah. But it is an interesting point. Like, we don't have a philosophical base in the Conservative Party of Canada, and the progressive conservative wing of that seems to be at war with that party.
Yes. Well, so to me, it's like you have the neoliberals of the progressive conservatives against these new populist movements, which, like, in my mind, I don't see them as having a necessarily coherent political ideology outside of libertarianism. The closest one, I think the other one you mentioned was well, there's the evangelical Christianity, which seems to be attached to it, and then there was one more you mentioned, the
charismatic.
No, it was like a political one. Sorry, it was Ayn Randian.
Oh,
right?
oh yeah, Ayn Rand. Yes, yeah.
This like strange unholy wedding, right? And there's a great BBC documentary called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And it talks about, it's really good. It talks about how in the 1980s, all of these Silicon Valley people were overly influenced by Ayn Rand's philosophy in that part of California. And a lot of these people would have been young, like Elon Musk would have been, you know, well, I guess this was a bit past his time, but that technology and tech companies and that Ayn Randian philosophy seem to have been welded together in the 1980s in Silicon Valley. And now, only 40 years later, I think we're seeing the fruits of that marriage when you see, you know, people like every single tech company leader at Donald Trump's inauguration. Because
even though he was at war with some of them just 6 weeks before that, but you're right, there is some sort of common thread.
To me, it's the libertarianism and the Ayn Randian ideology line up. Because if you've ever had the unfortunate experience of reading Atlas Shrugged, it's right. Though it's like this whole victim mentality of like, I am the Nietzschean Uberman, and the government and all of my social obligations are only lashing me down from achieving my full potential. And so they love the libertarian political idea because it means removing the barriers. Right. But then they still have to act out their superiority complex, which is inherently anti-democratic. They want the neo-feudalism that Alexei de Tocqueville predicted because it validates their victim complex that they got from reading Ayn Rand.
Interesting.
So that's why I think the bedfellows happen there. Why the evangelical Christianity? Because when your political platform is, I think I'm better than you because I'm a smart tech guy from California, it's not very popular.
Yep.
And so I think they need the kind of cultural Christianity to kind of,
they need each other, because Christianity in North America has been on such a decline, right? I, having studied some of the stats, in 1991, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church of Canada, had 3.7 million adherents, and I grew up as an Anglican, and then I converted hard to charismatic Christianity when I was 18.
Nice. That's a good age to do it.
And then I came back to Anglicanism when I was 28 and thought I was going to be all into liturgy and into, prim and proper theology with fine rational thinking and exegesis and all this nonsense that I don't believe anymore. But that church now has like 1.6 million adherents, and Christianity overall continues to decline. It's in its last breath of political influence and power, that although there's always been the separation of church and state, for 150 years to 200 years of American and Canadian existence, there hasn't been any reason to doubt the connection, because everybody it was a homogenous sort of religious culture for the most part.
Certainly.
And now that there's just this immense diversity and people are changing their minds about things and leaving the church, becoming atheist or agnostic or whatever, they just don't know what to do with that loss of influence and power, except to grab onto really bizarre creatures, political creatures and movements like Donald Trump's movement, or a Fatine Grisecci here in New Brunswick, or and you kind of, anytime I talk to these folks, and even when I reflect on my time in them, it's like they're really fear driven.
That's right. These grievance politics about the loss of religion, or white anxiety, like you're so right. They drive it all through fear. Just a funny aside, I had a similar journey. I went to Catholic school growing up.
Okay, so did Joe, actually. It's funny.
No way. And then I studied science during that YouTube debate bro era, and I was like, oh wow, religion's completely delusional, because I fell into that. And then I went to an Anglican church in my late 20s, a very progressive one. And it helped have this more balanced view of what it all meant, I guess. So that's funny. And my favorite funny story was the Anglican church, at least over here, they elect their bishops. Yes. And if you go to the debates, no one's allowed to clap. No one's allowed to indicate any kind of support or disdain for any opinion said. And so it's just this very silent room of all the congregates and the people running for bishop just saying their opinions to dead silence. And I thought it was the most democratic thing I'd ever seen in my whole life.
It's true. I've never thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. Like you can't bring your hype crowd.
No, no bluster, no nothing. Just what's your opinion? And everyone just has to sit there and think about it silently. I loved it. I sat there. I was like, this is the best thing I've ever seen.
That's interesting. And absolutely, there is so much richness in that tradition, not just the Church of England's or the Anglicans, but I think of the Mennonites and some of the dispositions that came out of that, with them sitting in silence until something holier than the silence, arose in the meeting to take its place. So you'd have these Quakers sitting for 5 hours in a church hall with no one saying anything, just waiting for some sort of impartation from the divine.
Now with all the technology, that actually sounds like not a bad idea. I bet some
that
tech
sounds
pro
like therapy now.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you ever listen to Paul Wells?
Paul Wells, I can't say I have.
He's like a political journalist. He writes and everything. He has like a rule, and I wonder if we can kind of comment on what's happening right now to us as a country. What are we observing happening? Because there seems to be a battle for influence on which way to go. It's kind of like there's been one battle won right now for this side, you could say. This we'll round up this out as we chat, but the communitarian side of us banding together to figure out what the hell to do together, but it has to be significant. We've kind of all agreed that whatever we're going to do together, it needs to be significant. We need to stop doing the over-reliance on others to kind of backpack us militarily or economically or whatever. We're going to have to step up. And that was certainly Carney's pitch. It wasn't, it was more of a somber, hey, this is going to suck. It's going to hurt. We're going to have to do hard things. But I know how to navigate this as best we can. I know the systems. I know the places. I know what's at risk and how to navigate it, and vote for me kind of guy.
Yes.
But like within the country, there is sort of these warring realities, because the Conservatives still got their best result ever. And so we want to pay homage and give some respect to the Conservatives, because there's some rich history there and very helpful kind of perspectives. But with the Conservative Party, do you see them doubling down on grievances? Like, is there more room for them to just grab more frustrated young people?
Yeah.
Because we look at it and we're like, yeah, I'm 35, you're 40. We've got kids, and it's like, whether we can buy a home or not, it's going to be a big question mark, even at our age. So I get the grievance.
Yeah.
And I get the fact that the boomers, who are the wealthiest generation to ever walk the planet, basically kicked the ladder down behind them and said, we're going this way, and you'll have to figure it out. Oh, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and stop drinking macchiatos.
Yeah.
You'll be fine, just like we were, despite the inherent advantages. So like, do you think there's room for the Conservatives to grab more people? I heard Poilievre talking about that. Like, yeah.
Oh, certainly. I think and I have friends who work in the Conservative Party and were working on this last election in various capacities.
Okay.
And I'm not going to talk too much about it because, it's I don't want to air anything personal, but my understanding, I'm really just trying to give myself a sense of authority to the listener that I have a sense of what's going on. I think from the party level, this is the move, right? Because you have to understand, I'm sure you guys get this, right? Like the real politic of it is that they think about it strategically. It's like a business, they're going into work and they're saying, how do we just get these votes? And say, oh, I went to a conference, heard this new idea. It's called petrol populism. Like, let's run a campaign. And they're like, oh, great strategy. They high five. And they're not really thinking about it on the deeper level of the consequences for the moral fabric of our society, right? They're just,
that's so true.
It's horrifying, but that's the reality we live in.
Yeah.
And so from the party level, I don't see a shift. And we see that from the fact that, they seem to be backing Poilievre still, because he was very successful, as you pointed out. 41% and they didn't win is unheard of.
Yes.
That they didn't form government is wild. Now, to shift it a little bit, because you're so right. I think my dream is that we all come to this communal realization that the utilitarian ethics we've relied on for so long don't work. Yeah. And that we come together and maybe negotiate a new social fabric from that sense. And for me, I think that the Conservative base, who experiences the grievances you're talking about, right? The utilitarian answer, and this is why the Liberals under Trudeau just tanked, is they said, our macro's great, our micro's not working. The most utilitarian answer you can give, right? Like, oh, the line's going up, don't worry, we'll figure out the houses through the market logic.
Yeah.
And that sent people over to the Conservatives. It sent people to the NDP because they have that same conviction together that the utilitarian logic of markets is not giving us community. It's not giving us a life worth living. It's not giving us a home or the basic necessities. The ruthless efficiency of the market we live under is not working for the average person. I think that's the common thread between conservative and progressive voters. And to me, my goal is to help people identify that the enemy isn't communists, or the enemy isn't, libertarians, or whoever you want to pick. The enemy is the utilitarian ethic that drives market decisions. And when I talk to my friends who are like, I went to graduate school, I know real communists, right?
Yes.
They're like, no, markets are the problem. And I say, is it markets, or is it that we let markets be ruled by utilitarian ethics? What if it wasn't a free market, but a fair market, a virtuous market? Would that not be better? We've done that for thousands of years as a species. And they go, okay, maybe if we didn't value profit over all other things, that would be a better way to run markets. And they say, well, yeah, I guess there are problems with, a state administration that collects and redistributes everything. Some of it goes missing. It's very inefficient. Anyways, all that to say, we have a lot in common. And my goal is to convince people that we just need to take a step back from utilitarian ethics that are just inherent in the way our society has been growing since the Enlightenment, in my opinion.
Because really, you can put people on a spectrum from utilitarian to communitarian and have this, ability for them to see, hey, like I'm actually a little more over here, but that doesn't mean I reject all the utilitarian type things that make me feel comfortable in order to get, whatever cereal I want or whatever,
Yeah.
kind of.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And like a fun way, because I just had this conversation with my dad as well. And a fun question. This is from Michael Sandel. You ask people, do you think we have a greater moral obligation to our friends and family, to people who live down the street from us, people we don't know? Do we have greater moral duties to our families than Canadians? And it's really interesting. And my dad, he's an engineer, so he's a very logical thinker. And he says, I want to say no, like all people, we have this common moral obligation to all human beings. But he says, but my heart says like, yeah, like I care about you, my son, more than I care about a stranger that I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's a way to help people kind of tease out their understanding of like, oh, I guess like I am shaped by the social bonds around me in the world, and that it's not arbitrary prejudice that to do so. It's that the people in your life shape your identity. Your identity is incredibly valuable to you as a person, and so you owe something back to the people who helped shape who you are, whether it was positive or negative experience.
But that seems to be so missing now. And I'll give you like a common TikTok that I see. It's this background. It'll be like this guy. It's usually a dude. It's usually a dude who looks like me. And he's in the TikTok video and he's like on a grinding wheel in a metal shop or something. He's like, every day I get up at 7:30 in the morning. I don't see the government anywhere. I drive to work and I go and I trade my time for labor and money, and I come back and I don't see the government till Friday when the government comes and tells me, like this super libertarian. And then you go below it, and it's just, of course, you see a bunch of people being like, so you didn't drive on any roads, you didn't take a bus to work, you didn't need the hospital that week, you never went to school to learn how to weld, you idiot. Like, He's like, hey, you are standing like Isaac Newton, right? Like, if I see fire, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. We don't have a lot of that. And this whole conversation around Alberta strikes me that way too.
Yeah.
They want to say equalization, you guys are ripping us off. And we're like, we built you. It was millions and millions of dollars in Eastern money, resources, people, food that seeded the West. It was a civil engineer from Ontario that pioneered the technology to extract tar from the tar sands.
I didn't know that.
And it was all federal investment.
Yeah.
Like there was no investing class in Alberta.
Us and them at all. It was, we're building a country together.
Yeah. And now it's like, well, we're cashing in.
Yeah.
Screw you guys. It is what it feels like from a Atlantic perspective.
And because I know in the East there's oil as well, and it has not been treated as generously by the federal government at all, completely neglected. So there's so much unfairness there. I think you're completely right about that. And the way I see it is, in the same way most of Western society has been a victim of neoliberal policies.
Yeah.
Right. Brian Mulroney, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and they sold the lie of trickle-down economics.
Absolutely.
I feel like Alberta was sold that hardcore. Their entire well-being and the well-being of their communities is reliant on the price of a barrel of oil. And they've had conservatives in power for 70 of the however many years, who all bought onto this train. And then now they're just selling them grievance politics to cover for the fact that they destroyed their communities through neoliberal policies. There is no trickle-down economics. And now they're mad at the rest of Canada because they believe that we're the ones that robbed them of this, Eden that they were supposed to have built on oil.
Which I would argue they have a bit of an Eden. Because we have talked to, we're involved in with all these, other counselors out there in all these municipalities. We go to these conferences, we talk to the folks out there. They have a lot better taxation for industry than we do here in New Brunswick. Unbelievably so.
Oh yeah.
And they actually spend a significant amount more per capita, right, on social services for Albertans.
Wow. They have the most robust public sector of any province, even greater than on a GDP per capita contribution basis. They outdo Quebec in some areas. And
so they're spending the money on the people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so the joke is that Albertans love public services but hate taxes, but they haven't had to collect taxes. Like, here we are, we have the country's largest oil refinery, and our listeners will be like, oh my God, you guys always talk about this. But right down the street, 4 miles away from my house in the middle of this city, it's the biggest risk factor from a public safety perspective of any city in the country. You've got the country's largest oil refinery that pumps out 350,000 barrels a day.
Wow.
And it pays less in taxes to the municipality than our general hospital does. And
so you talk to Albertans about this as counselors, and they're like, oh my God, you let industry get away with that?
Absolutely.
And so you're like, really diametrically different than what you can hear about
all of a
the
sudden,
general Albertan person.
Yeah, it's true. When we talk to municipal councillors out there, all of a sudden they become the most socialist thinkers you've ever met in your life.
They're like, we have a rink, we have a walking track, we have a volleyball court, we have
6
like
splash pads, 24 public libraries. They're like, what is going on in Lac-Magish County, Alberta? Like,
this is wild news. I didn't know any of this. That is well. Let me switch.
No, and it's interesting, eh?
Well, I'd love to reverse the role and ask you guys a question of how do you because obviously that seems like a misunderstanding of perceptions of the way different people in this country are going through different challenges, right? The failures of various provincial governments, the successes of various provincial governments. How do you build that kind of coalition where we can kind of see each other, I don't know, more honestly? To me,
we're the wrong people to ask. I feel like we can't talk a whole lot about it, but if you really want to know about coalition building, on May 12th, there will be a public hearing in St. John Common Council that we're on. And I want to say, like, it is going to be one of the most polarized issues that has national significance. I mean, we're only a small city, but we have the country's fastest growing port with the country's biggest port capacity, rail capacity, and an airport that can handle a lot of cargo with just a little bit more investment. And it has the land. It could land Boeing 747. So we are sort of the only place, if we're going to try to uproot our dependency on the American economy to the south and move to the European Union, we're really the only game in town. We got a deep water, ice-free port that's just had $250 million in modernization and all this capacity. And we have the country's oil refinery. So when you hear, and I love this on CBC, they talk about energy going east and energy east pipeline. No one ever mentions St. John. And that's where it's coming. There's only one place to send it. It's here. But, meanwhile, we have residents who are outraged at the idea that we would expand industrialization because that might disrupt the forest that's here. And it will. There's no question. But, shipping lithium batteries from China to San Diego to go on a train, to go on a truck, to land in your dooryard is way worse for the climate on aggregate than mining in Timmins, Ontario, and refining in St. John to ship to the EU. It's way less intensive. It's way more protected. So it has been really difficult for us. It's really difficult for me anyway. I don't know if you have a different opinion to answer that question, because we have been hoping and yearning for the grassroots of our community who are very poor, like inordinately more poor than other cities. We have that poverty problem. Despite the fact these multi-billion-dollar companies are here. We've been hoping that the people really grab onto a transformational thing and do it right, organize and demand the changes and pound the fist at the provincial government to get industry to pay its taxes so we can fund the services that they deserve. And instead, it's this really vitriolic, how dare you build anything in my backyard? And I don't want to misjudge their whole side, because I'm still weighing that decision. I'm still trying to figure out, how do you make a decision here that has the implications of 70 years of future potential to wetlands and forest and backyards and all that. So it's really hard.
Thanks for I mean, no kidding, man. That's a big decision.
Big decision, and it's one that's divided our community, and we've seen opinions on all sides of it. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens on Monday. But I think it speaks to a broader conversation that I think all Canadians sort of need to have about, if Carney's saying we're building, and the building's happening, it's going to be in our backyards. Like, it is going to be in our neighborhoods. We're going to have to like grasp onto this concept of YIMBYism, which is yes in my backyard, to try to figure this out, because St. John and the country, we've talked about growth for how many years? I guess that's a very neoliberal concept as well.
Selling growth.
Selling growth. And so now it's actually happening, and we need to make room for it. So it's going to be a real tough conversation, I think, across this country.
Wow.
Obviously.
Yeah. Do you have like, I don't know, is there places that kind of give you, I guess the other question back to Carney and his role in all this, like, do you have hope that Carney can move the needle in a positive direction?
Oh, I mean, yes, I would say I'm most well read on his housing plans.
Yeah.
And I think that's also the best area to highlight this difference of opinion between a neoliberal utilitarian, which he often gets accused of being a neoliberal banker or whatever, versus this communitarian virtue ethics approach, which is that there are zero market incentives to build new houses right now. One, because housing, it's a huge part of our GDP. So if you lower the price of housing, then you lower our national GDP. Two, during the pandemic, a whole bunch of people got persuaded by TikTokers that real estate was a profitable source of investment, which is a terrible idea, because it believed that the market was going to continue to balloon up and up and that they would double their profits in 2 years. Now they're realizing the rent they charge doesn't cover the mortgage. So if you lower the price of housing, all of those people are in serious financial trouble.
Absolutely.
So I was
just going to say, like, real estate leasing doesn't build or grow or manufacture anything, but it's our country's biggest GDP per capita industry. It's wild.
So the private sector on its own has no economic market, I say utilitarian, incentives for lowering the price of housing or introducing enough supply to do so, which is what we need, what the average person needs to have that life that we dream of. And so the crown entity of Build Canada Homes is exactly that idea. They say, well, the market logic doesn't make sense because people need houses, so we just have to build them regardless of what it does. And I think this is my prediction, and I could be way off at this. I think there's going to be a strategy to introduce supply of housing at a rate that lowers the price over time.
Yep.
Because they're going to back integrate into our natural resource economy. So there's going to be a GDP boost from buying natural resources to build the houses.
Timber, steel.
Aluminum, creating factories for the prefabricated stuff. I think there's a way that you could do it where you could lower the price of housing over time while diversifying the aspects of our GDP that are now back into natural resources that we're selling within the country rather than across the border. And these new technologies of prefabricated homes, that could also be a source for GDP growth to, again, wean us off of this. And then my other crazy prediction is I could see them introducing a federal program that would help people who bought real estate as renters to kind of offload that real estate if it's not working for them financially, which would, again, introduce more housing into the market.
Yeah. Well, there's a 7.5% vacancy rate in the country. Like 7.5% of all buildings, national average anyway, are unoccupied, vacant, boarded up, abandoned.
That's crazy.
Speculated on. Yeah, and that, I've been doing. I'm doing a housing initiative here through our nonprofit called Vacant to Vibrant. Really, just trying to turn abandoned houses into affordable housing for people.
Wow.
And there's no pathway for it. There's no current government program federally that will touch anything less than a 5-unit. Most of these were built in the 1800s and 1900s and are like 4plexes and 3plexes.
Wow.
And, been bought up by Ontario real estate investors, like you said. But they don't have any clue what to do with them, no expertise, they don't have.
And there's a big wave now of a giant portfolio that just dropped in the market because these outside investors were like, oh, this is such a great idea. And then, oh, wait, this is actually a lot of work and there's no pathway for these buildings.
And we don't live here.
And so now they're all back out there. But you're meeting with the MP this week because how is that not the lowest hanging fruit that there is? Existing envelopes all over the place.
Standing structures are greener than new construction. But we need the new construction. I really liked your idea, or your prediction there, because we currently have a winner. The sector that wins is real estate and leasing. And that's property management companies, realtors, like lawyers that just close on that. Like that sector, that's what they do. They don't build anything. And that's been the winner. We are going to have to make them a loser. Yeah. They're going to have to lose something And Millennial Moron said this too. I thought it was so good. He said either millennials are going to have their heart broken, and it already is.
Yeah.
Boomers are going to have carry some water and have their heart broken.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate that your house was your retirement plan, but that's an unfortunate reality. You know, we've made some mistakes and had to rent. So it is just what it is.
But the thread you drew there about, hey, what about our natural resource sector and getting some advancement in that sector to backfill the needs here, but also in the construction sector to meet those needs. Yes, Beatrix.
I think she likes this idea.
But that's almost like quantitative easing. It's like, that's what it sounds like to me. Yeah.
Right. Which I guess a central banker, you know, this is why I'm predicting that I hope so. Anyways, this is not, this is just my opinion, right? I could be totally wrong about this, but to me, it would make a lot of sense to do it, really. Just a little caveat. And then the other thing I'll add is to this question about, do you see hope in this, is I think the other thing is to bring it back to Charles Taylor and communitarianism. Charles Taylor, I think, is probably my favorite interpreter of Karl Marx, because there's a lot of Karl Marx you got to leave behind, in my opinion. But the stuff that Charles Taylor brings forward is essentially saying Karl Marx changed the way we looked at history by asking this fundamental question, which was, why do so few disproportionately benefit from the excess of capital and goods that we have in society? I really enjoyed this talk. It's been lovely getting to know you. And
and we'll make sure to link to your socials for our audience, and hopefully we'll get some new followers and some more engagers.
Yeah, I'll repost it for sure. Thanks a lot, guys.
Awesome. Talk soon, Trevor.
Bye. Take care.
The following program was provided by a valued member of our local community. Rogers TV is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas, and opinions. For more information, please visit our website.
Welcome to the Lou and Sue podcast,
where we chat about life, love, and what we've learned.
So grab your cutest mug
and join us.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome to the Lou and Sue podcast. Today's episode is Beat It.
The Ick Factor.
The Ick Factor.
So if you guys don't know, I'm going to read you the definition, the Urban Dictionary definition for ick. So and I didn't know what this was till like 6 months ago. So if you don't know, it's okay.
Yeah.
Something someone does that is an instant turn off for you, making him or her, no, making you instantly